Modern life tells you a very simple story about bone health. Drink your milk, take your calcium, hit the gym a few times a week, and you're good. Strong bones. Problem solved. But what if that entire idea is missing the real point? What if everything we believe about bone strength is only a small piece of a much bigger story? One that started thousands of years before supplements, before gyms, and before modern medicine even existed. Because here's the part that completely changes the conversation. Hunter-gatherers living around 7,000 years ago had bones so strong that, in some measurements, they were comparable to modern orangutan. And they didn't have protein shakes, calcium pills, or structured workout plans. They simply lived. Now fast forward to 2014. Researchers at the University of Cambridge made a discovery that challenged everything we thought we understood about human bones. They studied skeletal remains from ancient populations in Illinois, analyzing hip bones from 4 groups in the same region. 2 were hunter-gatherers, and 2 were agricultural communities. Same geography, similar genetics, but completely different lifestyle. When those bones were placed under CT scanners and examined in detail, the results were shocking. The hunter-gatherer bones, dating back roughly 7,000 years, showed trabecular bone density comparable to modern great apes like orangutans. That trabecular structure is the internal spongy lattice inside your bones, especially near joints like the hip. It's what absorbs impact every time you walk, run, or jump. But the farming populations living in the same region just 6,000 years later showed something very different. Their trabecular bone was about 20% less dense, weaker, more fragile, more prone to fractures. At first glance, you might think, well, that's obvious. Modern life is sedentary. But here's where the story gets surprising. These weren't modern office workers. These were medieval farmers, people who worked the land all day, every day. No cars, no computers, no sitting behind desks for 10 hours. By modern standards, they were incredibly active. And yet, their bones were already significantly weaker than ancient hunter-gatherer. Even more interesting, when researchers compared medieval farmer bones to modern human bones, they found something unexpected. They were roughly the same strength. That means the major drop in bone strength didn't happen in the last 100 years. It happened thousands of years earlier when humans shifted from hunting and gathering to farming. So what actually changed? To understand that, you have to look deeper into the structure of the bone itself. The Cambridge study focused on the femoral head, the ball-shaped top of your thigh bone that connects to your hip joint. This area carries most of your body weight every time you walk or stand. Inside that region is trabecular bone, the spongy, honeycomb-like structure responsible for absorbing stress. In hunter-gatherers, this structure was dramatically different. The trabecular struts were thicker, more connected, and more reinforced. The internal architecture looked less like thin rods and more like solid plates, built to handle constant impact. In farming populations, that structure was thinner, more spaced out, and less robust. And this wasn't random. Both farming groups showed similar bone patterns, which suggests it wasn't a coincidence or a local issue. It was a consistent shift in lifestyle. So researchers asked the obvious question, was it diet? The answer appears to be no. Both groups had access to locally available foods and adequate nutrition. There was no widespread calcium deficiency that could explain the difference. And if diet were the main factor, you'd expect to see changes across the entire skeleton. But that's not what happened. Arm bones stayed relatively similar across populations. It was the leg bones, the weight-bearing bones, that changed dramatically. That tells us something very specific. Bone strength is driven far more by mechanical loading than by diet alone. And then the research went even further back in time. When scientists examined even older hominid remains, dating back around 150,000 years, they found bones that were even stronger than those of the 7,000-year-old hunter-gatherers. One of the lead researchers, Colin Shaw, summarized it perfectly. Something in our distant past created bone strength that exceeds anything we've seen in the last 10,000 years. So what were these early humans doing differently? The answer is surprisingly simple. They moved constantly. Hunter-gatherers didn't exercise. Movement wasn't a scheduled activity, it was survival. They likely walked anywhere from 5 to 15 miles per day, tracking animals, gathering food, and moving between camps. But it wasn't just the distance that mattered. It was the unpredictability of the terrain, uneven ground, hills, rocks, rivers, obstacles. Every step required the body to adapt. Every movement created different angles of force through the skeleton. On top of that, they carried loads regularly. Food, tools, water, hunted animals. Nothing was lightweight or optional. Everything was physical effort. And there were no rest days, no weekends, no, "I'll train tomorrow." Survival required movement every single day. This created something critical inside the body, a constant cycle of microstress and repair. Tiny amounts of stress in the bones triggered adaptation. The body responded by adding more bone material, strengthening the internal structure over time. That dense trabecular network researchers observed wasn't genetic luck, it was adaptation. It was the skeleton responding directly to environment and behavior. Then everything changed with the rise of farming. At first glance, farming might seem just as physically demanding as hunting and gathering. After all, farmers spent long hours working outdoors, carrying tools, planting crops, harvesting food, and caring for animals. But the type of physical stress placed on the body was completely different. Hunter-gatherers moved across vast landscapes, climbed over obstacles, carried uneven loads, sprinted after prey, and constantly adapted to changing environment. Their skeletons were challenged from every angle. Farming, on the other hand, introduced a more repetitive lifestyle. People walked the same routes every day, repeated the same motions season after season, and spent much of their lives within a relatively small area. The varied and unpredictable loading that had shaped human bones for hundreds of thousands of years began to disappear. And bones are incredibly responsive to the demands placed upon them. They do not become stronger simply because they exist. They strengthen when they are challenged. As the daily stresses of life became more predictable, the skeleton adapted accordingly. Bones became lighter, more efficient, and less dense. They remained strong enough to support survival and daily activities, but they no longer needed the extraordinary robustness seen in prehistoric foragers. Over generations, the human skeleton adjusted to this new reality, reflecting the lifestyle of the people who carried it. This is where the research becomes especially fascinating. Scientists have repeatedly emphasized that there is no anatomical reason a modern human could not develop bone strength comparable to that of ancient hunter-gatherers. In other words, this is not a story about superior genetics or a lost human species. The biological potential still exists within us today. The difference is environmental. Modern life simply does not provide the same type of constant, varied mechanical loading that our ancestors experienced. Even athletes, construction workers, and dedicated gym goers rarely face the non-stop mix of climbing, carrying, jumping, balancing, and long-distance movement that was once part of everyday life. Research shows that high-impact athletes can develop bones that are 20 to 30% stronger than those of sedentary individuals, yet they still often fall short of the remarkable bone strength measured in ancient populations. The evidence for bone adaptability is impossible to ignore. When loading disappears, bone loss can happen surprisingly fast. Studies show that just 1 month of bed rest can reduce leg bone density by around 3%. Astronauts living in microgravity can lose more than 10% of their bone mass within months because the skeleton no longer experiences the force of gravity. Yet, the opposite is also true. When bones are challenged consistently, they respond by becoming stronger. Children participating in regular high-impact activities can increase bone strength by as much as 5.5% in only 6 months. The message is clear. The human skeleton is not fixed. It is constantly remodeling itself in response to the world around it. We evolved for continuous movement and physical challenge, but modern life has removed much of that demand. Our bones are simply adapting to the environment we have created. So what does this all mean? You don't need to live like a hunter-gatherer, but bone strength depends more on how you move than what you eat. Impact, variation, load, and consistency matter most. Walking uneven ground, carrying weight, climbing, jumping, and changing direction all signal your skeleton to adapt. Bone isn't static, it's alive, constantly rebuilding based on demand. The key lesson is simple. Hunter-gatherers never studied bone density or biomechanics, but their daily life naturally built incredibly strong skeletons. Their environment did the work for them, without planning or supplements. We understand the science today, but knowledge alone isn't enough. Strong bones aren't built in comfort, they're built through movement and challenge. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like it and subscribe for more content just like this.